Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. We have Jill Whitcop here from IAB Tech Lab, and by popular demand, we are doing this session all about seller-defined audiences. We're going to do a run-through just to talk a little bit about what seller-defined audiences means, how it works, and then leave a little bit of time for Q&A. And some follow-up discussion. So with that, I'm just going to pass it over to Jill. Good morning, Jill, and thanks for joining us here with IAB Canada's community.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here, and we'll be talking a little bit about seller-defined audiences, but I can't just dive right into seller-defined audiences without giving you guys a little bit of context of how we're really thinking about audience targeting and that portfolio approach to addressability. So this is kind of conceptually thinking about a world in which third-party cookies aren't available and how you would address an audience with a number of tactics. And I think that the key message here to think about, and you forgive me if you've seen these slides before, if you heard this a million times so far, I just think it's helpful for context setting, but there really is no silver bullet there. And so the way that we at Tech Lab have been thinking about this is planning around just that range of scenarios. You're going to have a couple different types of use cases that are available to you, and to facilitate a campaign, you would use multiple strategies in order to sort of get that reach and accomplish your campaign goals. And so through what I'm going to just buzz through a little bit here, we have it kind of broadly bucketed into three buckets here. I'm going to actually go backwards and start on the right-hand side of the slide. So the linked one-to-one audiences first. And those are the kind of things that would be most closely associated with kind of the world as we know it today with third-party cookies. But that's where you, between advertiser and publisher, you have sort of a connected identity that you're able to facilitate buying and selling against. You both understand the consumer, you've given the consumer transparency and control over their choice to sort of be in that grouping, and then you're able to transact against that when you have that kind of ID or scenario. In the middle, we have the browser or OS linked audiences. This has again, no third party tracking sort of outside of a specific website, but those are some of the proposals that you see and hear about in Chrome's Privacy Sandbox initiatives or Apple's SK-Ad Network initiative. So those are the ones that are really operated by the browsers, or the proposals coming up through the browsers and W3C. And then the one we're going to talk about today, because the one where seller-defined audiences lives, is this concept of unlinked first-party audiences. And that's where the advertiser and publisher don't have sort of that unified, they don't have an ID that they're able to transact against. And these are more contextual audience targeting, private marketplaces. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Apologies if that was a little bit
You're good, Jill. You're good.
Redundant.
And just a reminder for those of you dialed in, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A, not the chat, but rather use the Q&A if you've got anything you'd like to ask, and then we'll get to those questions when we break.
Great. And then I'm going to dive into this really scary slide about seller-defined audiences, but I'm going to try and break it down with you guys, because overall, the goal for seller-defined audiences is to facilitate a way for sellers, for publishers, to really capitalize on that first-party data. That, as a publisher, you understand the content on your website, the type of audience that's coming to see it, and kind of how best to think about what that audience really means. And so what this is trying to do, we're going to go, I hope you guys can see my pointer here. I'm going to take you up the left-hand side of this first, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is create sort of a taxonomy and technical pipes to facilitate the publisher alerting the seller to what type of information is available on the website. That could be contextual, or what type of segment, that would be the audience, is is available. And that can be done through a standard bid request. So a lot of this is going to be focused on OpenRTB, in which you're able to use some new extensions that we created to really provide information about the type of segment being used. And you can actually help, as the publisher, define that segment, hence the seller defined audiences portion. You can do it yourself. You can use a third party. There's facilitation for both. There's facilitation for multiple. We really tried to leave it as open as possible. And that's what we're kind of articulating here on the left-hand side. So this is, it can be done through, an SSP or header bidding, especially in a pre-bid environment. If you're using pre-bid, that actually, there is a specific module within pre-bid that helps to facilitate this. So if you do use that for monetization, then it's definitely something to speak with the pre-bid team or whoever managed that within your tech stack about. And then I want to say, because you've probably read some of the information about this in the press. And so it really is, at the end of the day, we're trying to let the seller provide the relevant information about what this first party audience is. So what does this audience look like? What are their interests? What, using the taxonomies available, how do we describe them to the buyer? But there has been some question around, so how do I know, trust but verify is what I'm going to go with. How do I know that that is what they say that it is from the buy side? And so we do have a couple of different, that's sort of what the right-hand side of this slide is talking about, that there are actually a few programs in place to help from a compliance perspective to make sure that you are taking the steps that you can to be transparent about how the data is collected and making up the audience, as well as attesting maybe that it's been through a compliance program. So the first standard that I'm going to talk about is called the Data Transparency Standard. And so that one is specifically, we used to market it or talk about it as the FDA nutrition label for data, for audience data. And so that is a standard in which an audience really gets a nutrition label. It talks about things about how the data for the audience was collected, which really focuses on things like frequency of update to the data, recency of the data, types of devices that help to sort of build that audience, things like whether consent, what type of consent framework was used to get people into that audience. And all of that can be found on, I can actually go through that in a minute too, if there are more questions. In the Tech Lab website, there is a data transparency standard, and that's to help with the labeling. So that's to help buyers understand what this audience is. And then if you want to sort of take an additional step, there's also a compliance program around that the Tech Lab runs, where you can actually have your audience, your use of the data transparency standard certified, so that you kind of get a check mark next to it saying, as the company facilitating this, I haven't made it up. It's been checked by an external third party. It has sort of a seal of verification that we're following the rules set forth in the data transparency standard, and we're declaring things appropriately. And so that's one path that helps from a sort of trust but verify perspective from how these audiences are defined. I see a question. I kind of want to stop because I want to see if, sorry.
It's actually not a question.
Okay.
Jill. It's just a comment. Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
Keep going.
And then I'm going to jump over to the other. So that's how sort of the verification piece is done through the data transparency standard and the compliance program. But then I do want to jump back over to the actual, if we're going back to the right or the left-hand side of the slide here, talk about a little bit of how the audience itself is described. And so there are a few different ways to do that. You can use things like again, this goes to a couple of the Tech Lab standards. There are audience taxonomy standards. And so that is available on the Tech Lab website. I'm going to switch my sharing for a moment to the website. And so this is the seller defined audience. Actually, let me orient us. So on the Tech Lab website, when you're looking at standards, you can go straight to SDA, which gives you sort of everything you need to know about seller defined audiences. And so what you can look at here, I'm within downloading the full specification because that also has links. Because a part of the complexity here is the fact that we're really putting together a handful of different standards to facilitate a single transaction. So the heart of what we're trying to do is pretty pretty straightforward, I think, in that you're trying to allow a publisher a way to declare what that audience is on any given request. But then, to make sure that that's facilitated through the ecosystem, you have to have the taxonomy with which you're describing the audience or the content that made sort of the decision for the relevant audience. Then you have to have the transport mechanism, which is through OpenRTB. That's how you're communicating from the publisher to the buyer. And then you have to have sort of this concept of how is the audience verified, so that it's not just a single source of declaration, but there's a source of declaration and a verification if that's of interest. So those are like the three big buckets that make up the seller defined audience framework. And I did want to go into, so the, I hope this isn't a little bit too in the weeds, but when you are looking at the way that the taxonomy is actually declared, so how the audience itself is declared, you can do things like within, so this is actually within the user object of OpenRTB, and there is a data sub object. And within that, you're able to then declare segment IDs and as well as segment taxonomies. So it's important to think about the fact that you could have multiple taxonomies, and each taxonomy could have its own segment associated with it. And just to give an example of what that means, like what kind of taxonomies are we talking about? Just within the IAB Tech Lab taxonomies, there's actually a concept of like, we have a whole list that you could be using. I'd recommend the audience taxonomy 1.1. That's the most recent for like ways to describe an audience. So that's one standard that you could use. But there's also like if you're working with a third party or with a partner on this, there's a concept of like the vendor specific taxonomies. So if you are working with a partner that actually has their own taxonomy, then those partners can actually declare their taxonomy IDs here. And then you would have like the segment IDs that they give you within that. So just grabbing an example off the top, so you could have like if you're using JW Player video content taxonomy, then that would be taxonomy ID 502. But then, within that taxonomy, there are likely actual content categories or segments that have specific identifiers associated with them as well. So it's really about declaring that double layer, that this is the taxonomy that I'm using, and then this is the ID within the taxonomy. So that as a buyer, they can check, okay, this is the taxonomy that I'm going to sort of to decrypt this, like to know what this number of segment taxonomy 504 means. They're going to go look and they're going to, potentially they have an integration with JW Player where they actually are able to understand that 502 and whatever that subsegment would be. And so that's sort of how flexible the specification is, because it allows, and then the bigger value too is that you don't have to limit yourself to just one. You can actually declare for any given bid request multiple taxonomies and multiple then segments within each of those taxonomies. So like because we understand that, the world of audience categorization isn't simple. You generally don't fit into like a single category within a taxonomy. It's usually much more complex than that. And there are multiple different categories that a consumer would fall into when they're on a given website or based on what they've browsed. And so you do have the flexibility to give that richness of data in the request as well.
That's great. Jill, do you have any sense of how many people have implemented the taxonomies, how many publishers? Like, has it reached critical mass to the point where you're like, yeah, it's good. There's good uptick?
We have seen, I mean, I'll jump back to my slides to talk a little bit about, we are running, or the working group is running a proof of concept of this as well. So we definitely have seen a lot of integrations from the publisher side. With this like specific proof of concept, we have 5 publishers, but it's across thousands of domains. And there are, especially with the pre-bid module, it really makes it so that it's easier to adopt on the publisher side in a pre-bid environment. If that's the way that you monetize, then there's an easier path there. So we definitely have seen that. We have a few DSPs that are participating in this proof of concept. We are working on what they were trying to do actually is get specific testing budget to be able to test against, like from a specific advertiser, to be able to test against the seller defined audience features set up on the publisher side. So I will say that like it is like on the buy side that reach out to your customers and trying to facilitate who's spending where and how to put this into a campaign. So that's been a little bit slower, but they're definitely getting off the ground with a few campaigns to be able to start actually seeing spend flow through the pipes on these.
That's great. And because I think that it's often when you roll out stuff like this, publishers often ask themselves, where am I? Am I late to the game? Have I missed the boat? Am I, have I lost some traction here? So it's just good to know that, we're still sort of in the early stages of adoption, and that this is, it's okay to be looking at this now, right?
Yes, I agree. Yep.
Okay. Cool. And then we've got a question here from someone. Does the IAB have an understanding of which percentage of SSPs that can take such open RTB2 data from the publisher side, such as site and user data, and actually pass them over to the DSPs? Similarly, do DSPs ingest such data passed along from SSPs? Good question.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have a list. That's sort of, unfortunately, the way we are with each of our specifications is that since we don't see the bid request data, it's hard for us to track. But I do know anecdotally that definitely the SSPs that support pre-bid, which is far and wide, have access to that. And I think at least a handful, there are 4 participating in here that have, or I'm sorry, 8 participating here that have like set up the way to at least facilitate passing this extension, like the declarations of OpenRTB through that extension path. And then from the buy side, I think it's been a little bit slower. Like of the 4 participating, I think that 2 of them have like the read and decision built, but they are, that's again part of the ongoing development associated with the new standard launch like this.
Great. And just anecdotally, how's it going?
I think it's going well. We have the group is really engaged. They're committed to getting sort of all the kinks worked out of an initial first campaign, testing new communication paths, and they're able to sort of work together through any small hurdles that come up to clear the path for the rest of you, as sort of making sure that this is all that there's an easier path to being able to launch these types of campaigns in the future, and getting some benchmarks to be able to set advertiser expectations as well.
Good stuff.
I actually think that was what I wanted to cover from like a presentation perspective. Just making sure to sort of re-highlight that the seller defined audience, focus on the fact that what we're trying to do is enable that communication when there's no linking ID, and that giving the publisher a lot of that control over being able to declare the audience associated with their first party data. You do that through using multiple standards, and that's why some of these slides look a little bit scary. But at the end of the day, those standards are trying to describe the audience through taxonomies, trying to facilitate passing of that audience information through OpenRTB, and then verifying that audience through the data transparency standard and a compliance program associated.
Great. Well, thank you for this. And let's see whether there's any questions, or if anybody wants to, you know, if you want to raise your hand also, I think we can potentially unmute you so that you can comment. There may not be any questions. So if there are not, then what we'll do is we'll allow our side to digest sort of what they've heard and think it through. And then if there's anything that comes our way, then we'll just aggregate into sort of a flowing FAQ that we were talking about earlier, and pass that on to you, Jill. I do see a red line. I believe there'd be an impact on open auction. What about other auction types? Can you share the impact there? There'd be an impact on open auction.
So
yeah,
I can try and guess around it, and then maybe you can ask a follow-up question if I don't hit the mark.
Sure, use chat. Whoever asked that, you maybe use chat if you want to add to it, or use Q&A again just to sort of respond to what Jill's saying. Go ahead.
You definitely can. So when I think of open auction, I'm thinking of OpenRTB without any type of deal or PMP in place, open market available to everyone. There's definitely facilitating that. I have actually seen, I believe, and I'm that there was an SSP that also did some testing through a deal ID specifically. So I do think that would also work if that's sort of the difference that you're looking for, like through open market or through a PMP of some kind. So I actually think that there's same way to translate this information through the deal structure.
Was that helpful, anonymous attendee? Okay, that's great. Good stuff. What else did I want to say before we let you go? So we'll aggregate FAQs. And the other thing is that we wanted to remind our members that you do have access to Tech Lab membership via IAB Canada. So if you're interested, please reach out to us. Felix has asked a question about why we're recommending, or why you were recommending specifically 1.1 over the other taxonomies. Any rationale for that?
So from the audience taxonomy, I was, you know what, and I might have just been wrong on the most recent number. I might have not have updated that page. I apologize. I am recommending the most recent audience taxonomy.
That's cool.
Which is 1.1. The others, and that's why, so like the reason I was pointing at audience taxonomy is because a lot of times this is like, there are other methods for doing content declaration. So if you're focused more on a specific, like doing contextual targeting only without sort of like also taking the other step to declare what that audience is that likes that content, then you can use other methods to do so. I don't know that it's necessary to do that within this format. But so that's why I focused on audience taxonomy, and that's only of the Tech Lab standards too. So like if you're working with partners that have their own types of content or audience taxonomies, like those are all fair game and nothing against any of those. Like that's just from like the full list of Tech Lab standards for taxonomy declarations. I think that within the seller defined audience, audience taxonomy is the best there.
Great. I'm not sure whether I want to let you go yet, because every time I wind down, somebody asks a question. Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay. Okay, we're going to take that as a no further questions, but if there are any, then please feel free to send them through. You can send them through Slack, and you can send them to either Laura or myself, or to just send us questions if you have any. And then we're going to follow up with the publishers as well. We're going to have a publisher council follow up email. And Jill, you mentioned that you were updating, you have an updated deck that you're working on. So we'll make sure that when that's ready to go, then if we can share that, that would be great. This has also been recorded. So if any of you have teams that you would like to, share the link with, we'll do that after this call. And I think that's it. That's a wrap. So Jill, thanks so much for your time this morning on this lovely Friday. And I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you guys for having me.
Okay, bye.